Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Eric Shabazz, and you're tuned into the Startup Basement podcast. And today we're going to be talking about how to build Black Silicon Valley. And now, in order to actually figure out how to build Black Silicon Valley, we first need to quickly understand how Silicon Valley came about in the early 1950s, 60s, 70s, and then fast forward, you have the very advanced Silicon Valley of today. So in this episode, we're going to be breaking down what are the major components that's going to need to be in place in order for a Black Silicon Valley to come about today. Now, Silicon Valley today is worth several $1 trillion of assets. It's one of the richest places in the world. It's one of the largest nations in the world based on its actual per capita GDP. I mean, it produces probably $253 billion in GDP alone per year just in Silicon Valley. And the actual market cap of Silicon Valley is probably in the upwards of $9 to $10 trillion of total firm value. So Silicon Valley is one of the richest, most advanced, basically nation states, which has happened to be a region in San Francisco Bay in human history. And so as African Americans, as the tech scene has democratized access to wealth, to creation, to companies, how can African Americans develop their own Silicon Valley with their own group of people, with their own culture, with their own founders, with their own funding sources to basically grow their own technological edge in the United States or objectively in the world? So that's what we're going to be breaking down in today's episode. Now, I'm going to take you back to pre-World War II. When we were gearing up for World War II, necessity basically gripped the nation. And basically during war times, and this is one of the most important factors in basically our ability as African Americans, as Black Americans, as African descent Americans, to actually mobilize millions of people, the hearts, the minds, the dedication, the capital, the country, behind one issue has been war. The Industrial Revolution kicked off because of war. War was the necessity that allowed governments to say, hey, firm, you're going to produce this product. You're going to mass produce this product. You're going to mass produce this product because we're going to war. We need you to make helmets. We need you to make all these different products. That is your job. As this happened, this allowed the Industrial Revolution to kick off. Without the necessity of war, it would have been virtually impossible to get so many firms, so many industrial organizations to organize their labor in such a way in assembly lines, using machines, mass production. All of the necessity of war allowed this. And this was no different during World War II. During World War II, in a place called Route 128, which is actually in Boston, Massachusetts, it was called the Route 128 Industrial Corridor. It was basically the early days of an innovation hub before Silicon Valley. It basically was made of older, more structural hierarchical companies like IBM. You had companies like Digital Equipment Corporation, and it was your traditional 1950, 1960 business structure, right? We're a very large corporation with a CEO at the top, with a whole bunch of people under, with dedicated employees who stayed with the company for 30 years, with a research R&D department that secretly worked on basically new products. They didn't share information with other firms. They didn't collaborate. Everything was done in secret. They only had exclusive licensing deals with suppliers and manufacturers. They didn't just switch between manufacturers. They would make deals with particular alliances and they would stick to them. That was the hierarchical corporate bureaucracy structure of most companies in Route 128, which is Boston, Massachusetts. Now, Boston, Massachusetts, or Route 128, which is the tech corridor of Boston, Massachusetts, also is famous for housing Harvard University, which is in Boston, and also MIT, which is the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is famous today in 2021. So we already had a pre-existing tech hub that was based around basically mini computers, microchips, radios, and things of that nature. As the war efforts required, government had to go to war. So we were gearing up to create anti-radar technology, radios, and other components that was going to use in war efforts. So the government allocated billions of dollars to universities to create research departments where they'll be able to research and develop these products that could be used to aid the war effort, right? So the first time in history, the government set a precedent for universities getting funded for research. Today in 2021, research organizations or research institutions are called Tier 1. Tier 1 means that they're a research institution that have funding. Not only are they funded by the government, but they're also funded by private industry today. But before that, during that World War II era where we're gearing up for war, we set a very important precedent that's going to lead to what we have like Silicon Valley today, because what they did was start to create funding, large amounts of money that was allocated to research institutions. They set up research departments in Harvard. They set up research departments in MIT. And then over in the West Coast, they start setting up research departments in Berkeley, start setting up research departments in Caltech. And so what this allowed was lots of engineers and talented individuals to work on technology together. And so because of the necessity of the war effort, they also mobilized thousands of engineers to go down into Boston, Massachusetts, to enroll in these institutions to work on this exciting technology for the war effort. Same thing in San Francisco or the Santa Clara Valley, which became Silicon Valley today. You had lots of young, ambitious engineers going down to work at these research institutions, but also large government defense contractors also attracted thousands of engineers down in Santa Clara Valley, all for the war effort to develop these technologies for the war effort. So you had companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, etc., that basically attracted thousands of engineers, right? So I'm not going to get into all the war stuff. I'm just going to save you time. So what are some key factors that allowed Silicon Valley, or the early days of Silicon Valley in Boston, Massachusetts, in Route 128 to come about? Number one, massive necessity. In order to get that much capital in the hands of research institutions, in the hands of defense contractors, in order to basically attract thousands of engineers from all around the United States and rapidly get them into one locality and one region, it required the necessity of war. It required the cooperation of the U.S. government to do that. And that's exactly what happened. So World War II kicks off, World War II ends, and then you start to see the development of two distinct industrial systems, right? Basically in Route 128 in Boston, Massachusetts, you start to see an industrial system that was based around for individual firms competing in secrecy with very unique limited rivalries that didn't share information. Your IBM basically structure, right? Very large company. They have their research development department. They don't share their information. Everything's top down. Everybody wore suits and button-ups, right? However, over in Santa Clara Valley in California, which became San Francisco Bay, after the war was over, you had thousands of engineers in San Francisco Bay, right? And they developed lots of interesting technology for the war effort that they started to commercialize. They started to create companies, right? You had these engineers, and all of a sudden, for the first time in history, you have a small local area with thousands of engineers, minds who can create things. So they had basically co-founders who can get together and start companies. And that's exactly what happened. A whole bunch of companies were started. The first venture capital fund was started. And basically you start to see these companies start to take off. However, remember I told you Route 128 was the innovation hub before Silicon Valley. It's like the older brother. It was dying out as a new culture started to permeate the West, which is in San Francisco Bay. Old school way to do it was you start a company, it's very large, you have a CEO, things move slow, you need the approval of the top to do anything, you didn't share information, you only use certain suppliers, so everything was slow. However, the world was rapidly changing, and the old school top-down culture of Route 128 was losing out to the new school decentralized network-based industrial system that was developing in San Francisco Bay. Now keep in mind, in the 1970s, this is kind of the era or the generation of love. So there was lots of sex happening, lots of counterculture ideals. And so that culture is basically what won out Silicon Valley. They was creating a culture where it was risk-taking, starting companies, sharing information. Even if you were a competitor, you were sharing breakthroughs. And that region allowed for a basically pollination of ideas and started to rapidly develop innovative, creative, outlier companies that started to develop as compared to Route 128 that could not keep up with the technological change that they were pumping out. So fast forward, Silicon Valley becomes the big winner, right? And we all know what Silicon Valley is today, right? You know, multi-trillion-dollar companies, one of the most innovative places in the world. And that's how it came about, right? It was the culture that separated Route 128 from the culture of Silicon Valley, this decentralized, celebrating risk-taking, sharing information, non-top-down approach, young people, counterculture mindset, which ultimately led to more innovation, which ultimately led to companies like Intel, HP, and basically ultimately led to companies like Facebook, Tesla, Apple, et cetera, right? So what is the big lesson we could take from the story of what allowed Silicon Valley to exist? You need massive mobilization of resources. That resources, both money and technical talent. And you need them in one region where they're near each other, where they can work together, make friendships, and build culture. You need a massive necessity that's probably large as war. That's a very difficult thing to come about. And that's why Silicon Valley and Boston, Massachusetts Route 128 is so rare. That war doesn't come around very often where you can get millions of Americans working together. You can get billions of dollars flowing into a particular area to make something happen out of absolute survival necessity. And so for African Americans to actually create a Silicon Valley, the number one thing we're going to need before we get to anything else is we're going to need war drums. What is going to be our war drums that's going to wake up millions of African Americans and African descent Americans and say, we need to start a technology hub in the United States, right? What's going to be that rallying cry that's going to inspire us or make us have absolute necessity to do this today in 2021? Now, the only thing that came close to that rallying cry, which I don't think is going to be the solution, was when you started to see talks about reparations. Every African American or African descent American knows that reparations is something that's basically a pipe dream that we know would be a good step in righting a very, very bad wrong that this country is staying with. And that is a rallying cry close to the rallying cry of war that every African American could get behind. And if they could take the funds from a reparation bill and say, hey, let's pump that money in investment into black tech, into black entrepreneurship, into black technical education in one area. And that area would be most likely Atlanta, Georgia, where it's the largest tech scene for African Americans in the United States. That's the type of necessity that would be required to get us on the same page, right? And that's equivalent to the necessity of war during World War II that got thousands of engineers in San Francisco Bay, hundreds of engineers in research colleges in Route 128 in Boston, Massachusetts, right? So that's the first thing we're going to need to happen. What's going to be our mobilizing, rallying cry that's going to get us to act at a large scale? Secondly, the government funded billions of dollars, ultimately, research institutions that gave them money to attract students to go to those schools, to attract engineers and technical talent to go work at those schools, to work on new technology. Where's the funding going to come from? They used government money, which was the U.S. money, to make that technical industry happen in Silicon Valley and Route 128. So if African Americans are going to kick off a tech scene, for instance, in Atlanta, Georgia, we're going to need the government to get behind research institutions in our HBCUs. Now, the reason I brought up Atlanta, Georgia is Atlanta, Georgia have 3 to 4 historically black colleges, right? They have Morehouse, they have Spelman, they have Georgia Tech. And so what would need to happen is we would need the government along with our own people to start getting money into those institutions to push more development of technical talent in STEM for African American graduates. Along with that, we would need money going into those schools and setting up research institutions that are going to start to attract some of the best African American technical talent from around the country to go to those schools and work on technical problems. And then from there, you're going to start creating an ecosystem of young kids working on technical problems. After school, they can hang out with each other, talk, cross-pollinate, and ultimately start companies, right? Because that's how Silicon Valley was kicked off. That's how Route 128 was kicked off, right? First, they created a necessity. Then they created funding to attract these people to go work on these challenges and technical advancements, right? And so that's the second thing we're going to need in order to kick off this technological thing. Now, the reason that Boston, Massachusetts, and basically Silicon Valley was chosen in the early days of the World War II war efforts was they had prominent institutions that were very important in setting up those research institutions. And so that's why Atlanta can be a great location to create our tech hub, because they have the Georgia Tech, they have the Spelman, they have the Morehouse, schools that are attracting some of the best and brightest of African Americans. We just need to spend a significant amount of money funding more and attracting more technical talent to take up technical degrees. Now, one of the big issues also, in order for us to create kind of a tech hub, gets a little bit more complicated. There's not enough African Americans in the pipeline who are getting technical degrees, who are in STEM, which means that now we're gonna have to correct some type of systemic problem in America, which is grade K through 12 education system for most African Americans and African descent people in the United States. We don't have the same level of quality schooling as some of the middle class counterpart white kids have. And without getting them early, they're not going to be developed and on a path where they're going to be able to even compete when it's time to take up engineering, computer science, physics, geometry, and other more STEM-based fields in college. So now our tech hub acceleration is highly dependent on fixing structural problems in the United States to even give our African American technical talent the opportunity to have the skills, the knowledge, and the ability when they come out of high school to even deal with engineering and other STEM fields. So as you can see here, we start to deal with some escalating complexity to even have an opportunity to even build a tech hub in the United States. So I want to thank y'all for tuning in to the first half of this episode. This is going to be a series on this topic. We're going to be continually developing these ideals and working through some of the challenges that we're going to face in the United States as we attempt to create the first Black Silicon Valley.